Hi everyone, and welcome to my talk. Thank you for joining. I will talk today about habits, habitus, normativity, and joint action. And the question that I want to address is how can we retain rationality as a normative criterion for joint action while also understanding humans as creatures of habit? Creatures of habits typically are associated with automaticity and therefore also non-agential descriptions of humans. However, I want to argue that through habit formation, individuals and groups can be set up, so as Bourdieu called it, and that such habits will typically be in line with normative expectations because habits are intricately linked with our reflective capacities and with the fact that we form these habits in social surroundings. So the setting up is in line with normative expectations through the way that we come to have these habits. What I want to indicate before I continue with this talk is that this paper is a programmatic paper. It's a project I relatively recently started. There will be a lot of details that are still open that have to be filled in later on, but this is the sort of bigger framework that I want to sketch first. So the talk of today has three parts. The first is the puzzle, that is the kind of automaticity plus agency question or normativity question. I will talk about habits and habitus as a solution to this puzzle, and then having that in hand, return to the normativity question. Okay, so this is the puzzle. On the one hand, we see that current philosophical understandings of joint action and shared agency rely on the idea of rationality as coherence, or the idea of rationality as all things considered. And through this rationality that is integrated into the joint agency accounts, normativity is also built into these theories. Empirical findings in social and cognitive psychology, as well as debates on skillful and habitual action, suggest that this account of rationality does not apply to a good deal of human action, both in the individual and in the joint action domain. So much of the empirical work in social psychology and cognitive science has focused on phenomena that philosophers would typically classify as unintentional, automatic, and non-agentic. Habits or habitual joint actions are also taken to be part of this category. So they're often described as coordination and not as joint action proper. And because of this, the link to normativity is harder to establish. And this situation spells trouble for the rationality as coherence approach to joint action and individual action, both as an explanatory framework and for the normative expectations and judgments about human action that it entails. So why does this matter? We usually are able to explain our behavior by means of reasons, also when we are acting habitually, both again in the joint action and in the individual action case. And we also find it undesirable to hold contradicting beliefs, desires, and intentions, and we also expect others to not do so. So here again we see that so finding this undesirable and having this as a normative criteria also applies to the domain of automatic behaviors that we show. So we have this, on the one hand, we have in the joint action debate already the focus on, for example, emergent coordination or lower level forms that allow us to coordinate. But what I would like to focus on is the present debates on heuristic processes, naturalistic decision-making, skillful action, and habits, where today I will really focus on habits, that show that people's actions are most times guided by less demanding rationalities. So the all things considered kind of reasoning or coherence disappeared, or at least the holism of a set of reasons might be about a smaller set of reasons. So we have intelligent behavior, and it's rational in some sense, but not in the sense that we typically talk about rationality. So pragmatists typically challenge the sharp dichotomy that other philosophers draw between theoretical beliefs and practical deliberations, but also between practical deliberation and habits. In some sense, they argue all inquiry is practical, concerned with transforming and evaluating the features of situation in which we find ourselves. So I'll say a bit more about how I understand habits and habitus, and how normativity is built into these theories and rationality as well. If we look at the discussion on habits and habitus, we see that there has been this move by scholars from the term of habit to habitus to move beyond the common conception of habit as a mechanical assembly or preformed program. So habitus does not come with the behavioristic connotations that have become really strong, that are tied to the concept of habit, and it is understood to be more flexible. So habitus entails competence and know-how. It captures the skilled activity of the expert player, not the conditioned response of the lab rat. It therefore also more clearly directly ties to Aristotle's hexis, and suggests to be acquired abilities rather than repetitive faculties, therefore also including practical reasons into the way we should understand habitus. However, as we also see in, for example, the work by Dewey and Merleau-Ponty, not everyone has made this move, and a lot of people still also use the term habit. And when I talk about habit in this talk, just as is the case with habitus, I do not want to refer to mere repetitions. So habits is also understood in this non-mechanical way, in this non-behavioristic way, so I want to understand habits as the sort of singular instances of acting within a framework, where habitus is also like pointing at the bigger picture, if you wish. So habits then are not rote or repeated patterns of behavior in this way of understanding. They are acquired predispositions to ways or modes of response. And habits allow us to make sense of the world, but at the same time, the world is also structured by these very same habits. And particularly, we will also talk a bit more about how the sharing of also such common ways of acting will not only structure the world for the individual, but also for the collective. And so, for example, if we look at the American pragmatist traditions, such as also like Dewey and Mead and Baldwin, we see that they argue that habits can clash. So several predispositions can be active, and such a clash then requires the agent to focus on a solution where reflecting is integral. So and in that sense, the habits can also be transactional and harmonizing. And yeah, as said, allow us to make sense of the world also when the habit itself is not, or the predisposition that is active is not the one that we're going to act on in the end. So looking at it from this perspective, so what we often see is that the question kind of like, how can I as a willing mind fight my bad habits or my habits? And instead, the question becomes, how can I, as a collection of habits, develop the most intelligent habits possible? And here we again also see this more Aristotelian view on hexes, habits, and habitus. So I just want to make clear that when I talk about habits and habitus in this talk, in both cases, I don't want to talk about mere rote behaviors. What I would further like to point at is that this question, so this second question, how can I as a collection of habits develop the most intelligent habits possible, is also intrinsically linked to the habits that we share. And so we'll say a bit more about this when talking about the notion of habitus by Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu offers an account of habitus, a structuring structure that lies between structural and individual approaches, therefore, as with the American pragmatist, also offering a non-binary approach. So the social world, as he describes it, becomes objectified into a range of probabilities and expectations that make us more likely to choose certain actions rather than others. So the habitus organizes us. It is a predisposition, a tendency, propensity, or inclination. According to Bourdieu, habitus is composed of systems of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures, that is, as principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at ends or an express mastery of the operations necessary in order to attain them. So we can talk about rules, and habitus is the locus of regularities. So social life becomes a pattern, and it is encoded in how we act, how we build our buildings, and what we show on television, etc. The habitus is the underlying structure of social life that becomes ingrained in how we physically move or talk in the world. How we behave is conditioned by these objective possibilities, which he calls the subjective expectations of objective probabilities. We respond to the mathematical probabilities of the social world, and subjective decisions depend on these calculations. Habiti determine what is and what is not reasonable action within a certain field, which then guides or restrains personal thought and action. So we develop consciously or unconsciously different strategies for organizing our future actions, and history gets codified into practice. In each of us, in varying proportions, there is a part of yesterday's man. So when Bourdieu talks about dispositions, this is to sort of move away from talking solely about social laws or structure on the one hand and individual minds or agency on the other. So he is asserting a middle ground where social laws and individual minds meet. Disposition, which is a key concept in Bourdieu's work, can be defined as a sense of the game, a partly rational but partly also intuitive understanding of fields and of social order in general, in a practical sense or practical reason, giving rise to opinions, tastes, tone of voice, typical body movements and mannerisms, and so on. The dispositions constitutive of habitus are therefore conditioned responses to the social world, becoming so ingrained that they come to occur spontaneously, rather like knee-jerk opinions, if you like. It follows that the habitus developed by an individual will typify his position or her position in the social space. By doing so, social agents will often acknowledge legitimate and reproduce the social forms of domination, including also prejudices and the common opinions of each field as self-evident. So the background, having its effect through a particular shared habitus, instantiates a normative force that plays an essential role in regulating social practices and contributing to social reproduction. Through deep learning processes or deep educational processes, including formal education practices, which are themselves shaped by background conditions, the individuals learn to expect nothing different. Such dispositions tend to generate the same dispositions in other people, and thus a certain normative order. This shaping process is to be understood to be both constraining but also productive, and in that sense it could be described as deeply hermeneutical. Having all this in place, we can now return to the normativity question that I started with at the beginning of this talk. So how can we retain rationality as a normative criterion for joint action while understanding humans as creatures of habits? That's what I started this presentation with. And I argued that through habit formations, individuals and groups can be set up to set off. And such habits will typically be in line with normative expectations because of our reflective capacities. So this set up is in line with normative expectations, and through the formation of habits and habitus, we can understand how this background allows us to act together in certain ways. I will say a bit more about the interaction between habit and reflection, and then make clearer why habits and habitus stand in relation to normativity and rationality, also in the collective domain. So if we look at habit and reflection, we see sort of like what I want to point at is this idea that also Dewey describes that man is a creature of habit, not of reason nor only instinct. So we have reflection also on or about our habits, or about what our habits should be when we are within the subject by means of others and in groups. So if we look at a subject might experience a clash of habits, which I described also earlier on in this talk, and this can lead to reflection. There could also be a novel situation in which there is a demand for reflection on what kind of habits or what kind of dispositions to develop in these kind of situations. It can also be that others are forcing us to reflect because they, for example, want me to act differently, or they give reasons for different behavior, or they are acting differently themselves, which might also lead to me reflecting on the difference between their way of dealing with a situation compared to mine. And then if we look at groups, there we can also see how the habits while we are acting together can clash, and we can have novel situations which again call for reflection. So there is a relationship between reflection and habitual agency, and this goes really deep. It's really, really ingrained into the understanding of humans as creatures of habits. And through this relationship with reflections, habits and habitus cannot be understood as separate from normativity. Normativity is ingrained in our habits and our habitus. And it's important to remember that this understanding contains more than mere expectations based on observations, because there is also this tie to reflection on the habits that we have. And I'm hereby, of course, not saying that potential changes based on such reflection necessarily come easy or quickly, but they are absolutely possible, and they are real. So if we go back to the kind of routes to joint action, so what we typically find in like some of the standard accounts is this idea that we have plans or shared intentions or shared commitments in combination with common knowledge about these shared plans, where typically there is a certain goal that's in the future, and this is constraining future actions of the agents that are involved. If we look at habitus and habits, we see that there are subjective expectations of objective probabilities. So we have common knowledge in a way, but the common knowledge is not about the future-oriented plans or goals that we might have, but instead it's about the expectations that we have, because we know that we are in a certain field where certain rules or ways of doing or acting apply. So in that sense, it's more past oriented, or the kind of common knowledge or the expectations about how we are going to act also are coming up from a different area. But at the same time, it's in the same way constraining future actions and possibilities. And The idea here is not that it's either or, but overall I think that just as how I talked about how reflection is an important part of an individual acting, also in the case of joint action we will see that reflection or might also mean that we have to settle on certain plans and commitments in combination with or further constrained by the habitus or the habiti that we're in, that we find ourselves in, and the kind of habits that we develop. That brings me to the end of this puzzle and a first attempt at an answer. I'm aware that more details need to be spelled out, and that would be something I would also look forward to discuss, where you see potential possibilities, where you see potential problems, and so on. So I look forward to the discussion, and thank you for your attention.